Perfect. Great. So welcome to the Palestine, Arab, and Muslim PAM Caucus panel discussion titled Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS. My name is Sang Hea Kil, and I'm a professor at San Jose State University, and I co-chair the PAM Caucus, and I'll be moderating this panel today. Please welcome our panelist, Palestinian National Boycott Committee member Olivia Katbi. From American Friends Service Committee, we have Noam Perry and Dov Baum. And the co-chair of the PAM Caucus BDS Committee, Omar Zahzah, who is also at SF State University. Thank you all for participating in this panel, and I think this is a much-needed activist intervention and an economic and political interruption of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I will begin with the CFA Indigenous Caucus land acknowledgement for the land that San Jose State University occupies, which is my institution. If you do not know what land you occupy, we will supply a link in the chat so you can find out. We want to acknowledge that we gather as students, faculty, and staff and community of San Jose State University that is situated on the traditional land of the Muwekma, Tamien, and Ohlone tribe, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well, to recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. Now, I'd like to read a shortened and updated PAM Caucus statement to help frame this panel. This statement is titled, Colonialism, Military Occupation, and War Are the Root Causes of All Violence. The CFA's PAM Caucus confronts racism within the CSU and throughout California in all of its manifestations, including, but not limited to, white supremacy and xenophobia, Islamophobia, Orientalism, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, anti-Arab racism, and anti-Latinx racism, misogyny, transphobia, and homophobia, as well as hostility to Palestine and to other indigenous peoples. The PAM Caucus feels immense grief and outrage over the horrific siege in Gaza. In violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Israel has engaged in the most severe form of collective punishment and retaliation against the Palestinian people of Gaza, including the bombing of hospitals, schools, and UN shelters, with no indication when this nightmarish military assault will stop. We are deeply concerned that the Israeli regime is capitalizing on the October 7th militant incursion to create another Nakba by forcing 1.1 million Palestinians in northern Gaza to leave their homes and land, while simultaneously bombing them and blocking their escape to safe passage. The death toll estimate stands at this moment at over 30,000 people and expected to rise, including over 10,000 children who were killed by Israel's nonstop bombardment during the last several months, wounding close to over 63,000 people. We are now entering day 145 of the genocide in Gaza. For the last 75 years, Israeli military colonialism, occupation, and apartheid has already caused widespread societal destruction for Palestinians, whereas over half the population currently lives in poverty. Subjected to water and food rationing, limited access to education and employment, limited mobility in what humanitarian advocates have called a quote-unquote open-air prison, Palestinian life is cut down on all levels amid widespread denial. Scores of human rights organizations have documented the ongoing systemic Israeli human rights violations of Palestinians living under this colonial and apartheid regime. Despite such overwhelming evidence, the USA has ignored these gross violations of Palestinian human rights, and corporate media outlets consistently spotlight the humanity and suffering of Israelis while failing to investigate and report on Israel's war crimes, let alone the suffering and pain of Palestinians, reducing them to mere dry statistics. Instead of supporting an immediate and permanent ceasefire, the USA government chooses instead to deliberately increase military aid and weapons to Israel in order to carry out this brutal genocide. According to USAID Data Services, the total USA aid to Israel from 1946 to 2023 is an estimated $260 billion. We cannot, in good conscience, watch and do nothing while the Israeli government violates all human rights conventions and ignores the human catastrophe in Gaza. Dissent against this atrocious siege is the only honorable and conscionable act. Silence is not an option, and neutrality only amounts to complicity. We must challenge those who hold power in our higher education system to stand up and speak out. The billions of dollars sent to Israel to support this siege could be spent in the USA for the people, including our students, who cannot afford the skyrocketing cost of tuition and fees, healthcare, housing, transportation, food, and other basic needs. Attacks on our colleagues, students, and academic freedoms are examples of epistemic and real violence on our campuses. This violence is directly tied to the horrendous genocide taking place in Palestine right now. We demand an immediate end to the ongoing massacre in Gaza and call on all our colleagues and the larger CSU community to stand with the Palestinian people and to stop this new Nakba. To that end, we join Palestinians and the international community to call for one, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Palestine and the opening of the Israeli-controlled crossings to allow food, fuel, and medical supplies and personnel into Gaza. 2, an immediate end to all USA aid to Israel. 3, support for a prisoner exchange. 4, pressuring the USA government to restore electricity, internet, food, water that Israel cut off. 5, investigation into these war crimes by international, reputable, and unbiased commissions. 6, honoring the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And finally, we call on all administrators in higher education to provide the necessary support and resources to protect our faculty, staff, students, and community members who speak out and protest this siege, as well as those Palestinian families and communities that are directly impacted by this genocide. This means making the CSU campuses sanctuary campuses for Students for Justice for Palestine and other student groups, protecting faculty, students, and staff from any retaliation and using CSU legal resources to protect targeted faculty and students. Audience members, please save the date and time for our next PAM Caucus event on Tuesday, March 12th at 1:30 p.m. CSU DH Dominguez Hill's Labor Studies and PAM present, quote, Palestine, an Anti-Colonial Perspective. So please join CSU Dominguez Hill Labor Studies and PAM for this particular event featuring Dr. Yusuf K. Baker from Long Beach. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, UCSD Faculty for Justice in Palestine. UCSD FJP is a collective of UCSD faculty who support Palestinian justice and liberation. They define faculty broadly to refer to all educators, including tenured, tenure track, and non-tenured faculty, staff, and graduate employees at UCSD. Please follow UCSD FJP at UCSD_FJP. And the PAM Caucus would especially like to thank Julia Talente, co-chair of the PAM Communications Committee, for all the behind-the-scenes labor with this webinar. We will begin with Olivia, then Noam, then Dov, and we'll end with Omar, and this will be followed by any Q&A from the audience. So please begin, Olivia.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to drag my slides into the screen here, maybe? Maybe? Okay, there we go. Can you see that? Great.
I'll give you a flag when you have 2 minutes remaining.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've worked in some capacity as an organizer for the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement since 2019. I also organized with the Democratic Socialists of America, which is kind of how I started doing BDS organizing. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of what BDS is. Let's see if I know how to go to the next slide. There we go. So Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions is a strategy called for by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations. This call was issued in 2005 by Palestinian trade unions, women's organizations, grassroots organizations, all came together to issue this call for the international community to utilize these tactics of boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning Israel until it complies with international law. BDS tactics have a really long history in struggles for justice around the world, including the civil rights movement in the US and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where we saw everything from produce boycotts to major trade union pressure to eventually government sanctions on the South African government leading up to the fall of apartheid. So BDS is an explicitly nonviolent movement. The civil society organizations that put out the BDS call have chosen to utilize these nonviolent tactics to address Israel's violence. And BDS calls for boycotts, including consumer, cultural, sports, academic boycotts, divestment, so withdrawing investments from corporations that are involved in Israeli oppression, as well as the Israeli government itself, and sanctions, so government sanctions on Israel. And those three tactics are used to achieve three goals, which I thought I had a slide for, but I do not. Number one, so the three main demands of BDS, number one, are an end to Israel's occupation of all Arab lands and dismantling the illegal apartheid wall. Number two is full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And number three is the right of return for Palestinian refugees. The BDS call is something that will remain in effect until these three Palestinian rights are fulfilled. So you can think of it like a picket line. You wouldn't cross a picket line if workers were out on strike at a specific location. We wouldn't shop there or do business there until their demands were met. And you can think of BDS the same way. The BDS call is based on anti-racist and universal human rights principles. And the BDS movement intentionally doesn't specify whether it should be a one-state solution or a two-state solution, just that any solution has to fulfill these three basic rights of the Palestinian people in order to be just and sustainable. And there's a lot more information on the BDS movement website, really useful frequently asked questions page as well, bdsmovement.net. There was my slide. Okay. So there are many different kinds of BDS campaigns to choose from. And you can choose, the most strategic and achievable target in your own local context. Some examples: municipal boycott. So, for example, a city ends a contract with HP or Caterpillar. Academic boycott, a university or academic association ends institutional collaboration with Israeli academic institutions. Sports boycott. So US teams refuse to play against official Israeli teams, or Israel gets suspended from FIFA. Right now, there's a call to ban Israel from the 2024 Paris Olympics. Consumer boycott, so a grocery store de-shelves Sabra hummus. Cultural boycott, so a celebrity cancels a performance in Israel, or a US event by Israeli cultural ambassadors or sponsored by Israel gets canceled. And then divestment, a city, university, church, trade union, pension fund withdraws its investments that are, investments in corporations or banks or Israel bonds themselves, corporations that are complicit in Israeli apartheid. And we're going to talk more in depth about a few of these later on. So there have been some big BDS wins over the years. Successful corporate boycott or divestment campaigns can collectively result in the corporation eventually divesting itself from Israel. So multinational corporations like Veolia and Orange have pulled out of Israel following BDS campaigns. G4S, which is a massive global security company, sold its business in Israel. Ben & Jerry's stopped selling ice cream. General Mills stopped manufacturing Pillsbury products in a settlement factory. The Norway Pension Fund just announced that they divested all $500 million they had invested in Israel bonds. Hayward City Council in California just divested the $1.6 million it had invested in 4 specific complicit companies. And this is, a global movement. There have been local city councils across Europe that have for years been part of the apartheid-free zone movement, where they've declared themselves apartheid-free cities. So whether that means, just committing to not having contracts or investments or ending specific agreements with the government of Israel. Artists and celebrities have boycotted Israel, canceled concerts there from pressure. Lots of major trade unions and academic associations have endorsed BDS. Major churches, investment funds have divested. We've seen activists and unions together blocking ships, Israeli ships, from being unloaded. We've seen governments suspending free trade agreements with Israel, and so many more. So the goal is for these kind of campaigns to build this pressure until Israel is completely isolated with no international support from governments or from major corporations, similar to the South African anti-apartheid movement. So many people are personally boycotting brands that have stated support for Israel. And that's great, but I just really want to stress that BDS, first of all, isn't just about consumer boycotts. And second of all, it's most effective when taken as a collective action. So more important than your own personal investments and purchases is working within an organization, so a union, a coalition, to organize an effective campaign and actually build power. So when you see massive lists of dozens and dozens of companies to not buy products from going around on social media, just keep in mind, the goal isn't to boycott as many companies as possible personally. The goal is to pick a few targets and exert enough collective pressure to actually win a campaign. So that means a specific company stops doing business with Israel, or a specific institution divests its investments from Israeli companies, or a specific city ends its relationship with the Israeli government. As similar to the boycott against apartheid South Africa, the BDS movement calls for a boycott of Israel's entire regime of oppression, including all of the Israeli companies and institutions that are involved in its violations of international law. BDS does not target identity. So, for example, we don't call for a boycott of a company because it happens to have an Israeli individual who owns it. We strictly target companies and institutions based on complicity in denying Palestinian rights. So when selecting a BDS target, we generally recommend considering the following 4 criteria. And I'm being given a time warning, so I will leave it here after this. Number 1 is the level of complicity involved. So the deeper the complicity, the easier it is to mobilize a campaign around any given target. There are hundreds of international companies, banks that are in some way complicit or in some way do business in Israel. So rather than, for example, targeting any international athletic footwear company that sells shoes and apparel in Israel, we had a specific targeted campaign against Puma, which sponsors the Israel Football Association. The IFA manages teams in Israel's illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian land. And we won that campaign recently. Puma announced that the contract with the IFA is ending. So that's huge. But that's an example of how we targeted a company based on their specific complicity and the strategic effectiveness of that campaign versus just like any shoe company that does business in Israel. Number two is the potential for forming a broad cross-movement coalition against the target. So a campaign targeting Chevron, for example, which is a campaign that we have, is more strategic than a campaign targeting a company that maybe only infringes on Palestinian rights, because Chevron is also a target of climate activists worldwide. It's also a target of indigenous rights movements worldwide. So intersectional coalitions are really important to, build that power and actually maximize the potential of winning. Number three is media appeal. So if two companies are equally complicit and we're kind of deciding between them, it's usually more effective to go after the more publicly recognized brand, or it's, a brand that maybe has some sort of niche that will have more media appeal, because we do want to attract more media attention to allow us to educate, reach out to a larger audience, and build that public pressure. And then the last one is possibility of success. So even if we meet those top three criteria, we don't want to launch a campaign against a target unless we have a reasonable chance of success. And success can mean different things. It maybe doesn't necessarily always have to mean actually canceling a contract, but we really do want to do more than symbolic victories. We do BDS because we want to win and actually affect policy change, not just to have, symbolic gestures. So sometimes, we might not see success in a campaign targeting a weapons manufacturer, for example. You're probably not going to get them to stop selling weapons to Israel because it's what they do, but there might be success in a campaign targeting a secondary target. So pressuring an institution to divest from that weapons company, for example. And I'm out of time, so I will leave it there, but happy to answer questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we're going to hold off on questions until the end. So if we can get our next speaker prepared, that would be wonderful.
Hi. So thank you, Olivia, so much for that. Thank you to all of my co-panelists and Julia for running the tech. As mentioned, my name is Omar Zahzah. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University and chair of the PAM Caucus BDS committee. So I'm going to be speaking for just a few minutes about academic boycott. When I was younger, right, my mom had this joke, and she told me, it's too bad that you're a writer because that means you're going to remember the things that people around you say and then bring it up years later in this dramatic fashion. And I don't know if she's watching this right now, but for the next, that's exactly what I'm about to do, to kind of intro this segment. My entry point for organizing for Palestine was basically when I started in graduate school at UCLA, and I became active with Students for Justice in Palestine, which I know many attendees are familiar with, right? And so that was work that involved BDS efforts, primarily campaigns to pass resolutions calling on the University of California Regents to divest from Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid. And one of our advisors, right, who was generally supportive of the work we did, once told me, I support BDS, but I'm opposed to academic boycott because I think we need the research coming out of Israeli institutions to help undermine the occupation system. So, I mentioned this person was generally supportive, and that's actually why the comment stuck with me so much. Now, being an assistant professor in ethnic studies, I've had some time to reflect on that comment more, its implications, and the necessity of the academic boycott of Israeli institutions. I don't think that academic boycott is more difficult than other types of BDS work, but I think, as that comment shows, it is a kind of BDS work that's challenged by kind of a unique form of propaganda that relies on a common, if incorrect, ideological bias, right? Namely, the idea that academic institutions exist independently of systems and structures of oppression and dispossession. And so allowing these institutions to continue to operate independently without any form of pressure will enable academics, and in this case, Israeli academics, to engage in the production of knowledge that will magically obliterate the material conditions facilitating Zionist apartheid, military occupation, settler colonialism, and of course, genocide. So this is related to the propaganda against the cultural boycott of Israel, which we heard a little bit about, in the previous presentation. propaganda which states that musicians should not be pressured into playing venues like Tel Aviv because quote unquote music brings people together, right? In both cases, the pressure that is posed by BDS is framed as something that will somehow inhibit processes of exchange and information sharing that have the potential to bring about a just solution for all peoples, something to that effect, right? Just because something is persistent doesn't make it true. Now, I've been hearing some variation of these arguments for years, and for the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is make a case for the academic boycott of Israel that specifically addresses why it is incumbent upon fellow academics to heed this call now more than ever in the 145th day of the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. First, let's go back to the erroneous idea that Israeli universities need to be spared from the collective pressure of boycott campaigns so that they can retain the independence that will allow them to produce the work necessary for some kind of a just solution. The problem is Israeli universities don't function independently of the Zionist settler colonial apartheid regime. In fact, they're key pillars of that regime. Research from Israeli academic institutions provides intellectual, ideological, and scientific benefit to the colonial Zionist militarism enforcing apartheid and genocide against the Palestinian people. For instance, it was Tel Aviv University that developed the infamous Dehia Doctrine, which calls for the sweeping, disproportionate targeting of civilian infrastructure that we are currently seeing play out in the Gaza genocide as well as in Lebanon. The Technicon, the Israeli Institute of Technology, develops military drone technology and remote-controlled bulldozers used to destroy Palestinian homes, as well as developing the construction and surveillance for the apartheid wall in the West Bank. Hebrew University has participated in the theft of Palestinian land in occupied East Jerusalem with some of the university's student accommodation located on an illegal Israeli settlement. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I don't have a lot of time. So I just want to flag that what I'm giving you is largely from the BDS movement page on academic boycott, and I encourage people to check that out because it's really an amazing resource for a lot of this information. Now, another argument against academic boycott that is related to the misconception I described earlier is that academic boycott supposedly threatens the academic freedom of Israelis. Now, there's at least two issues with this, right? One of them is that the boycott called for by the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or PACB, is of institutions, not individuals. And secondly, what about the rights and the freedom of Palestinians? As PACB writes, the Palestinian call to boycott complicit Israeli universities is more urgent than ever. Israel has deliberately targeted and killed 94 Palestinian scholars in air raids on their homes, including Islamic University President Professor Sofian Tayyeh and Professor Rifat Harir, poet and founder of We Are Not Numbers, in addition to 231 teachers and 4,327 students, with more among the missing. Israel has destroyed all Palestinian universities in Gaza, including by placing explosives in empty campuses meant to flatten them, and after some had been occupied and used as military bases and detention centers. It has completely or partially destroyed 346 schools. 15 major Palestinian universities stated that Israeli universities, complicit in human rights violations, should face international isolation, calling on the international academic community to urge ceasefire now and work to dismantle Israel's settler colonial and apartheid system. So, the destruction of Palestinian educational infrastructure and the murder of Palestinian educators, intellectuals, and learners inspired the group Scholars Against the War on Palestine to update Professor Karma Nablosi's concept of scholasticide to the current moment. And also, while we're rightly focused on Gaza, it's not just in Gaza, right? The military occupation regime in the West Bank has long been a dire threat to Palestinian education. And since October 7th, Palestinian faculty have reported an upsurge in Israeli raids, arrests, and detention of Palestinian students that has been an interconnected outgrowth of the Israeli government-engineered increase in settler raids and attacks on Palestinians. So earlier, I gave a few examples of how Israeli universities are not outliers in, but rather direct arms of the Israeli settler colonial regime. So let's focus a little bit more about their role in the current Gaza genocide. PACB continues, Israeli universities have a long history of actively supporting Israel's regime of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, and they are now supporting genocide. Among the examples, we have Tel Aviv University instituting a Hasbara, or propaganda course on Israel's Gaza genocide, bragging about helping make Israel's propaganda-ridden case before the International Court of Justice, and crowdfunding for care packages for soldiers committing genocide in Gaza. Hebrew University boasts of providing diverse logistics equipment to several military units, As most Israeli universities, Hebrew University also immediately instituted an enhanced financial package for student soldiers committing Israel's Gaza genocide, in addition to academic benefits. Technicon, which I mentioned earlier, boasts of a student who enlisted professors and alumni to create an AI-driven army of robots to massively increase the impact of pro-Israel efforts on social media, pushing Israeli propaganda, whitewashing its genocide, and repressing speech on Palestinian rights. The time for the global academic community to act is now. So we urge universities, scholars, unions, departments, and associations to call for ceasefire now and an end to Israel's Gaza genocide, and to work to end institutional ties with complicit Israeli universities. There's honestly no greater threat to freedom of any kind than genocide, and as with the very foundation of the Israeli colonial project, the Gaza genocide has been vastly aided and abetted by Israeli academic institutions. We're now 20 years into PACB's original call for the academic boycott, and I'm going to read out the terms of the call before reiterating as quickly as I can, as close to 2 minutes as possible, because I've just been given a time warning, before reiterating why it's so urgent to adhere to them now. So what does PACB call for? Specifically, it calls for refusing any form of academic and cultural cooperation with Israeli institutions, advocating a comprehensive boycott of Israeli institutions nationally and internationally, promoting divestment from Israel by international academic institutions, working toward institutional condemnation of Israeli policies, supporting Palestinian academic and cultural institutions directly without requiring them to partner with Israeli counterparts. Practical ways to support include joining organizations such as the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or USACB, which is the U.S. arm of PACB, signing a declaration in support of the academic boycott of Israel. There are several already existing examples in countries such as the US, South Africa, Canada, the UK, Belgium, and so on. Organizing for an association or union to support the academic boycott, and to research links with Israeli universities and arms companies at your present institution. So, in closing, I'd like to end with the following thought. Academia is such a bureaucratized space that it can make many of us inordinately risk-averse, even under otherwise ideal conditions. Right now, with the McCarthyist upsurge and repression of faculty and students speaking out in support of Palestinian liberation, or honestly, even just calling for a ceasefire, which should be the bare minimum, many academics, especially more precarious ones, may be especially nervous about taking the stand. But we're living through a genocide with full institutional complicity, and people are putting their bodies on the line, including in the most direct way, as we saw with the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell, to clog the wheels of the death machines of empire and imperialism, facilitating the mass murder of Palestinians that we are seeing play out in real time. The choices we make will be recorded in history. I submit that the bare minimum, the most basic thing we can do as academics, is to support the PACB call and boycott complicit Israeli institutions and the pursuance of Palestinian freedom and an end to Zionist settler colonialism and genocide. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Omar. I want to take us to another part of BDS, which is the economic BDS, or more specifically, divestment, and talk about the ways in which we were able to push some of these large corporations to step away from major contracts with Israeli apartheid, with Israeli genocide, with Israeli settler colonialism. And to do that, I will go a little bit back in time. I represent here the American Friends Service Committee, which is a global Quaker organization that has been active in Palestine and Israel for many years. And I also represent here another group, which is called Boycott from Within, Israelis for BDS. And that is a group that consistently has about 1,700 Israeli Jews that support different BDS campaigns from the inside, lending our support from the inside. Let's see if I can figure out how. So some of us have been involved with the BDS movement since its inception in 2005, and as part of a movement that was a joint movement, or a movement that was Palestinian-led, but called on Israelis as solidarity activists to join. And so a lot of the questions that I think come up, I think, in these discussions pro and against BDS can be solved just by reading the BDS movement website, including some of the information about the guidelines mentioned by Omar about what does it mean for us to work together and support the Palestinian struggle. What does it mean to create events or actions that are not normalizing? And we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you would like us to do so. So my involvement with this started back in 2005 with a project called Who Profits from the Occupation. We were trying to track specific involvement of specific corporations in human rights violations as part of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And this is still a fabulous resource that I highly recommend, whoprofits.org, that lists these companies. Today with the AFC, we publish another resource. It's called Investigate, which tries to complement whoprofits.org and provide a lot more research on mainly publicly traded companies and their involvement not just in the Israeli occupation, but also in things like the militarization of the US-Mexico border and the militarization of policing and surveillance across the US and the surveillance of immigrant communities. And we see that time and again, these are many of the same corporations, many of the same technologies and ideologies that repress people around the world. So, and this is our latest research. I have to give it a shout out. You can see the URL in the top of the page. We're tracking all the companies directly involved with providing weapons used now in the genocide in Gaza. So you can go to the URL out top. You can just go to fsc.org and you'll find it. Why do we do this research? Why is it important to track this complicity of specific corporations? And the answer is that when we say divestment, it's good to ask who is supposed to divest and from what, yes? The divestment we want is a divestment of these companies from their harmful activities, wherever they are around the world. It's the same companies that are involved in Israel and in many other sites of imperialism and colonial expansion and exploitation. So we want them to divest. In order for them to divest, in order for them to step away from their harmful activities, we need to make it a little bit more expensive for them to provide those services and goods. We just need to change a little bit the balance of power. And when I say we, I don't mean me, I don't mean our team in the AFSC, I mean we the people. You know, it's a global movement. You cannot do that without many, many, many thousands and sometimes millions of people involved. Olivia already mentioned some of the victories. We have dozens and dozens of such victories. Companies do step back from their harmful activities. And we see time and again that BDS has been successful. And this is something that is worth mentioning when people debate BDS, yes or no. We have a tool that works. And what it does, it makes large stakeholders that bring in a lot of money and political influence, it makes them step away from their complicity. We have to do it. It's not enough to do it. It will probably not liberate Palestine on its own, but we have to do it because that's a necessary first condition for anybody on the ground to be able to make any headway. Divestment is also a word that means just selling investment in the stock exchange or announcing a new policy not to buy certain stocks, as we see in many different campaigns. And so what does that mean? It means that sometimes we target a company and ask the company to step away from its direct complicity in human rights violations. But sometimes we target a company for many years and ask them to step away and they don't. And that makes them a bit of a lost cause. And that means we need to cut our ties to that company because our own divestment from Israeli occupation and oppression would mean for us to stop being invested in those activities through that company. And that can be us as workers in the company, it can be us as consumers that buy its product, and it can be us as investors in the stock exchange. In general, divestment campaigns are very, very powerful. I'm just, showing you some exciting slides. They are very powerful because they allow us to work across many, many issues. You see some images here from divestment campaigns in cities and in universities. And these divestment campaigns ask large institutions, such as a church or university or a union, to invest in the common good, to invest in us, in our communities, and to withdraw our investment in the stock exchange or in the bonds exchange from whatever is harming us, weapons companies, companies involved in the Israeli occupation or in militarization around the world and war. So by definition, this is an intersectional campaign because it is all about what are we going to be invested in for our future. Another thing that is great about divestment is it brings very far issues close to home. It's no longer about what's happening in Palestine or in Myanmar or in Russia. Now this is really about what's happening here in my place of work with my pension fund. Where am I invested for my old age? Yes. And that is about me and what do I support with my money. And that's a very personal connection that brings, I think, all these issues home and create an atmosphere where people are actually willing to deal with the facts, with the stories of what does each one of these companies do and what am I actually invested in, instead of stepping away and saying, oh, this is a big story, I don't know who started it, Israel, Palestine. Here we get the interest to actually learn more about what's going on. And last but not least, and I don't have a slide for that, so we can turn off the slides. I don't know how to do it myself. Last but not least, divestment, like all the actions of BDS, is an act of non-cooperation. What we are asking people to do is actually the least common denominator. We are asking them to withdraw our support from this ongoing system of abuse, harm, repression, and death. That's all. We're not asking people to go out and liberate Palestine. What we are asking them is not to invest in the continued military occupation and repression. That's all. To stop sending weapons, to stop, to just stop our support. And if we cannot stop the support of the US government, meanwhile, we just need to maybe stop the support of our own university, our own place of worship, our own workplace. That's it. It's a very minimalist request. And when we do that, we have to do it publicly, and we need to make it as public as possible, because the way divestment works is not really by any kind of direct economic impact. No company is actually immediately harmed by divestment. So that also throws away many of the arguments against harming innocent companies that just provide jobs or things like that. There is no direct harm. There is a serious reputational harm, potentially. There is potentially also a future risk to the company's ability to sell and so on. So it has an immense symbolic power. Divestment has an immense symbolic power, and as such, it is also impactful on the economic level. When companies look at the different businesses they have around the world, if they know that this business is going to make them the symbol of Israeli apartheid, they know this is potentially very harmful to their business. And that's what matters, because that might make them pull away from that business, and with it, pull away their entire economic support and political support for that regime. So I will pause here until your questions later, and call upon my colleague, Noam Perry.
Thank you, Dov. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for organizing this. This is an incredible event, and I'm so happy to be here. My name is Noam Perry. I work with Dov at the American Friends Service Committee. And before I joined the American Friends Service Committee as a hired activist, you might say, I was a faculty, was a lecturer at San Jose State University. So I'm very, I might know some of the people in the audience, even though I can't see you. And one of my main jobs at the American Friends Service Committee right now is to work with students, work with student groups. There are hundreds or maybe even thousands of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters around the country, and working with them, training them on activism, training them on divestment. My first experience with that actually was on the campus of San Jose State University. So in 2013, I think, or 2012 maybe, a group of Palestinian students on campus approached me and said, we want to establish a Students for Justice in Palestine here in San Jose State, and would you be our faculty advisor? And I'm originally from Israel, I'm Jewish. I was so humbled and honored to be given that opportunity. And of course I said yes, and they immediately launched a divestment campaign. I did some research for them for that campaign on what the university is invested in, and we won. But we won doesn't necessarily mean that the university divested. That is yet to happen. But what it means is that they passed a student a divestment resolution in the student government on campus. Now, it might seem like a small victory, but it was huge. First of all, we were the first CSU campus to do that. And second of all, we joined, I think now easily more than 100 campuses where that something like that happened, where the student body officially made a request from the university to divest. And now when I work with students, there's up times and down times based on semesters, based on years. Right now, there is a huge wave and a huge moment. I have to say I'm really sad that this is what it took. This genocide and mass killing is what it took to create this wave. But there is a moment now, and there's a moment that I think we should all seize. And I was given the job of kind of wrapping up this panel and sharing some insights about campus activism. The first insight I should mention is that it's great to collaborate. So I'm sure on this panel, in the audience, there might be a lot of faculty, there might be a lot of students. It's easy for us to think that we're on different sides of the story. The faculty are the administration, the university, the students are the activists. It's actually not the case. It's also easy to think that we as faculty, I'm speaking now as if I'm faculty, I'm not, of course, that we, the faculty, have the responsibility to teach the students. And I have to say that I learned so much from my students when I was so-called supporting directing their activism on campus. And I learned so much. And activism on campus actually works best when we collaborate, sometimes even behind the scenes. We don't have all to speak in the same voice, but it works well when we collaborate and we keep each other informed, students and faculty, and sometimes even staff, and sometimes some admins. We keep each other informed of our plans and what we're doing. I want to touch on something that Dov already kind of mentioned, which is the question of neutrality. Why are we so-called singling out Israel? And the truth is that we're not. We're actually the BDS movement as a whole, and when we request things, we make demands on campus, we're actually trying to resist the positive singling out of Israel. Right? Of course, our government, the US government, has already taken sides very clearly and very publicly, and it's very committed to its side taking, to its support of Israel. And that means in a way that we have also taken sides. Of course, our US government is supporting Israel in many, many ways, diplomatic ways, the massive amounts of weapons that are being shipped. the United States does not, of course, arm any Palestinian armed groups. And actually, it sanctions anyone who would do that. And in the same way, or in a similar way, our universities are collaborating extensively with Israeli institutions, and not at all or very minimally with Palestinian universities and academic institutions. And we need to ask ourselves why. You know, why is that, and what can we do to resist that? And again, repeating some of the things that were already said, how are we already complicit? Complicit is a harsh word. Involved. How are we enabling? How are we facilitating? How are we, in a way, a part of the systems of racism, apartheid, and genocide that we see in Palestine and Israel? And some things are, of course, obvious, but sometimes you need to dig a little deeper on each campus to find out what's happening on your campus, right? But the most obvious example is California is the largest economy in the United States, right? Our tax dollars are the ones that the United States gives to Israel to buy more weapons so that it could kill more Palestinians. That's an obvious connection. I suspect there are a lot of folks in the audience from San Diego, right? So, of course, in California, the main hub of weapons manufacturing is San Diego. So all the large weapons manufacturers that we know of that Israel is using their weapons right now, if it's Boeing, Lockheed Martin, RTX, Raytheon, L3 Harris, Northrop Grumman, all of them are throughout the state and specifically in the area of San Diego. I'm in the Bay Area, so of course Silicon Valley, you know, deeply complicit in Israeli apartheid. There are companies like Google and Amazon that already have existing campaigns targeting them because of their major contracts with the Israeli government for cloud computing. IBM, which is not in the Bay Area, but still a pretty large high-tech company, operates the Israeli population registry, which is racist and enables apartheid. The list goes on and on. You know, of course, Olivia mentioned in the beginning Chevron. This is a new campaign. Chevron is, of course, also headquartered in California, and California is also a hub of energy production. And then, you know, companies, whenever a company is close to your campus, then it collaborates with a campus, right? It has research centers that it sponsors, events, recruitment events, many things, sponsoring of academic courses or academic different things that the university does. So what can we do? A few things were already mentioned. I'll just repeat them. You know, like Omar suggested, academic boycott. Like Dov suggested, divesting certain stocks from the endowment. That's actually our specialty. If anyone here is interested in that, you can contact Dov or myself, and we can help you sometimes figure out what the university is invested in. We've helped many California campuses already with that. I want to mention as an example that CalSTRS, right? If you're a CSU faculty, I think your pension fund is with CalSTRS, and it divested its stocks from private prison companies back in 2018. That was the moment when Trump became president, had the zero tolerance policy, family separation. You know, we all remember how that went. And both CalSTRS and CalPERS, which is the largest pension fund in the country, divested from private prisons because of that, because of immigrant detention and because of family separation. I want to suggest that maybe this is the moment for the same institutions, for CalSTRS, CalPERS, for our own university to divest from companies that are enabling genocide. You know, it's not such a radical ask. Another thing we can do, of course, is to look for our contracts that the campus has, research centers, other types of corporate relationships that exist on campus. Another thing that I've seen many students do is create some kind of public pledge to not work for certain companies, or to boycott or to protest their recruitment events on campus, right? So if Chevron, for example, comes to your campus, or if Google comes and tries to recruit, you can have, some kind of countermeasure to that recruitment effort. And I want to again repeat some of the threads that we heard, that that these things may seem small. Like, who cares if students at UC San Diego or students at CSU do something? What does it matter? I had a colleague that called it the little fires everywhere approach. We want these companies, we want our government, and we want the government of Israel to hear as many voices as possible in as many methods as possible, as loudly as possible, and coming from every direction. That is the level of pressure that we need to be mounting right now. And we have to make it public. It doesn't matter what we do as individuals, like was said by, I think, all of the speakers before me. So, if you don't buy at Starbucks or McDonald's, good for you. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We have to make it a public effort so that everyone can see and everyone can also replicate and learn from our experience. The last thing I would mention is that we have a platform that is open to any organization, community, institution that's called Apartheid Free. You can find it at apartheidfree.org. That invites people to just take a pledge. Just say, our community, our organization, our institution, our university, our SJP chapter, our faculty association, whatever it is, we are declaring that we will become apartheid free. That's it. We're not telling you exactly how to do that. That's on you. So you make the declaration as an institution. It's not for individuals. And then you have a process and you decide, okay, how are we complicit and what are we going to do about that? And I encourage you all to do something, whatever you can do. It's really easy these days to despair and think that nothing is possible. I know I fall into that trap many times when I read the news. And eventually we will win. It's important to remember that. So I'll head it back to my dear colleague Sang. Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentations. They were very enlightening. I just want to mention that Noam and I are former colleagues in the Justice Studies Department, and I now hold the position of faculty advisor for Students for Justice for Palestine. So I would like to actually lead with the question, because the Students for Justice for Palestine did approach me about BDS, and I reminded them that we did have an historic win with Associated Students that Noam helped the students organize. And my understanding, because you organized me to speak at the Board of Trustees, that they did not support it, which is why it didn't officially take off. So as a faculty advisor for Students for Justice for Palestine at San Jose State University, what is the next steps then for me to advise my students on BDS advancement at San Jose State University in particular?
Yeah, maybe it sounds like it's a question from me. So, of course, BDS is many things, like we heard, so the first thing is to identify what our goal is, what is the goal and the target. And it can be to keep hammering on the divesting the endowment, the Tower Foundation in San Jose. Or you can decide that it's time to try a different thing, one of the other options I mentioned, or one of the other options that exists. If the decision is to keep working on divestment, the divesting the Tower Foundation, the main endowment, then I think we need to, of course, move beyond student resolutions at Associated Students and try to really figure out what mechanisms exist, how the investment policy is written of San Jose State or of the CSU system as a whole. This does not have to be a campus-by-campus effort. This can be a system-wide effort. The UC, what I mentioned earlier, for example, about divesting from private prisons, the UC system divested from private prisons in 2015, I believe. So this can also be a system-wide effort. And of course, I can help, read the investment policy, see what we can do. Maybe some folks have changed. Maybe some attitudes have changed. See who we can talk to in the investment committee. In the, you know, there are many levers that we can pressure, and it's not obviously clear what the first one should be. We should find out who is sympathetic and who we can work with, who is an insider. It's very useful to have an insider strategy for this, not just to be shouting from the outside like we all know how to do and sometimes love, but to have some kind of insider, someone who is in the university investment committee or investment office, or one board member, one regent, you know, who can tell us what's going on. If there are conversations that are already happening, maybe what they would need, you know, what would be helpful for them that we do from the outside. If we can find something like that, someone like that, that is golden. If we can't, then we need to look at what other options we have, and we can certainly help with that. Dov, I see you want to add something.
Yeah, I know that we're all kind of eager to go in the weeds and start solving it. What's a good lever for the next step? But stepping back in the big picture, looking back at what happened, let's say with the anti-apartheid campaigns, with South African apartheid, what did it take then for universities to actually divest? You know, if we have over 100 campuses where students pass student resolutions, and none of these universities actually sold any, I don't know, investment, what does it take for them to actually do that? What would it take for them to be the first to do that? And the answer is it takes a lot. So it takes a genocide, which is happening. But it also takes a lot of organizing on the campus level, which is probably not just students. There should be faculty voices out there. There should be faculty organizing out there. Faculty in anti-apartheid movement, talk to your colleagues who were there. Go to the archives, to the library, learn more about what happened then. It's really enlightening. There were hundreds of professors who got arrested by occupying the campus administration offices. This is what it takes. Another thing that changed since then is that now there is a much more elaborate system of responsible investment in the world that didn't exist then. And the first thing we need to ask these universities, and I don't know about the CSU system, is for them to be responsible investments in general, not just on Palestine. And for us to have a mechanism to influence what the state universities invest in and what they don't, through the CalPERS, CalSTARS, and, you know, how do we influence those systems? So building these structures, that's not just organizing in the streets for protest. This is also working to change the university. We need professors to be there, you know? So I would say we need to work on, what about staff? We're talking about university faculty and students. Staff are there. We need staff. We cannot work without staff, not just the finance and treasurer staff, but all staff, you know? So this is the time to organize on all levels the campus community in order to demand that there is transparency and there is a change mechanism, not just on Palestine, but also on Palestine. And the good news is, it sounds like a lot of work, yes, but the good news is it's quite doable. And because none of these monies have actually moved yet in all the years of campus divestment campaigns, anything that actually happens is a great win. So any first campus that actually takes a policy or makes an announcement about an intention to investigate the possibility of a new policy would be a great win, and it will open the door for many other campuses to do the same.
Nice. Thank you so much. And to follow up on that same line, we have a question from the audience member. Can you share some BDS success stories from university campuses and how those successes were achieved?
Yeah, so Dov already said no campus that we know of divested stocks because of Palestine, right? There were divestment successes that are not related to Palestine, like I mentioned. There are student groups that have their own pots of money. Sometimes the associated students or the student government or the student senate, they have their own controlled budgets, and that can reach sometimes millions of dollars. And we've seen just what was it, 2 weeks ago, I think, in UC Davis. One of the UCs, I think, students passed a resolution targeting their own money, which they control, so they don't need permission from, anyone working on the endowment. So that's very doable. Other divestment successes, it's actually hard. Most of the successes were dozens of associated students or student governments, student senates passing a resolution that makes it the student voice to ask the university to divest. Yeah, I'm trying to scratch my head. Dov, am I missing anything?
Yeah, I want to say that we had, okay, I want to say it again, even though I said it before. I'll just repeat it very, very shortly. It is a victory. A symbolic student resolution is a victory, and it has economic impact because it's in the public sphere, because it sends a message. The future middle class of America doesn't like Caterpillar, so Caterpillar should know that this is an ongoing future risk that they need to contend with. It has an impact on the companies involved, which is what this is about. Also, I want to say sometimes with other divestment campaigns, not necessarily on university campuses, we worked with cities, we worked with some churches. You can see how the actual decision of the institution, there were some big endowments, the actual decision of the institution to divest from one company or to change their policy to add some words about human rights, each one took on a completely different approach. It really doesn't matter. It whatever worked with their set of principles, their way of managing their investment, and also their faith in many times, or their values. It really doesn't matter, because the impact in the press was the Presbyterian Church divested from Israel. Also with UC Davis. UC Davis divested from Israel. If you read the fine print, each one is completely different. It's the student union that decided about their own funds, not some companies. It doesn't matter. So just that gives you some insight into how it works. The impact, symbolic impact, and the symbolic impact is many times the same.
Nice. Thank you so much. So this is another overlapping question, but you might be able to add some additional dimensions. How can staff, faculty, and students get started exerting pressure on their university? I've done research and know which companies the CSU system is invested in, and I'm working with students to make divestment demands, but how can we get more organized and exert public pressure that actually has an impact?
I just want to add to what Noam already said. Pressure to do what? So if you want your pressure to be efficient and effective, you need to find the lever of where do you exert the pressure? Where is the lever you should pull to know how to pull it? So in each university, it is different. So find out if there is any mechanism, if there is any committee, who sits on the committee. It's like lobbying research everywhere. It's more important than researching what the university is invested in. In fact, we find that this is not that interesting after all. What's interesting is to find out who makes decisions about investments. What do they care about? How do we actually talk to them? How do we demand an audience with them? Maybe what they need is not more public pressure, but more private convincing. That's where we need the research that we need is really that kind of research, the lobbying research, to understand the institution, to understand specifically what we want to achieve from it in the next few months. And then we learn what can we do to achieve it? Most times you need both. You need an outside pressure campaign as well as an inside lobbying effort.
So I'll ask another question. So, the PAM Caucus is a caucus of the CFA, which is the faculty union that represents the 23 campuses of the California State University system. And right now we are doing our best to try to convince our union to pass just a simple ceasefire and protect academic freedom resolution at the April Assembly. But we're running up to barriers, I think, that most people are running into in regard to having a hard time understanding that this is a genocide that's happening in Gaza, and this is an occupation that's happened over 100 years. And what advice would you give to struggling faculty unions who are slow to embrace and possibly complicit with the silencing of the genocide that's happening in Gaza at this moment?
I mean, one thing I will say is the AFL-CIO just came out in support of a ceasefire. So it's not a radical position at this point. Like, every major union representing millions and millions of workers has called for a ceasefire at this point. There's a new national network that's been launched, including UAW, NEA, National Nurses United. This is not a radical position at this point for a union to take. And it's actually you all would be falling behind what the mainstream position is at this point. So that's just a point to make.
Yes, ouch.
Isn't the CFA declaratively a progressive union, right? I think it's on the website somewhere.
On paper, and committed to social and racial and economic justice. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm unclear what's going on, other than maybe we have some leadership that's very insular from other social justice grassroots movements around this. I have emailed them about UAW and AFL-CIO and things, just in case they didn't know, but I don't get responses back. So their silence seems to be their form of communication about the issue. And I cannot break through, and the caucus cannot seem to break through their wall of silence around the issue. So we do have hope to pass the resolution that has nothing to do with BDS. It's just a ceasefire and academic freedom resolution in April. So I guess we're going to have to just figure out from there, based on our success or failure, how we can start pressuring for BDS in the faculty union. But right now, we're really just struggling over this ceasefire and academic freedom, which I think is behind, like you said, behind with everybody else in terms of union organizing. And so challenges, lots of challenges.
I agree with you that this is, of course, the time to call for ceasefire, and that's the most urgent and important thing. It might be good to ask for more, even if, you don't get it right away. I think there is a huge interest around us now with people who want to do more for Palestine. So there are some doors opening. One suggestion is the Apartheid-Free Communities platform. It's very, very suitable for an academic union or for any academic setting, because we built this platform. The websites that I've shared earlier specifically as an educational tool about Israeli apartheid. There are lots of educational materials there. And then you become part of a global network of communities and zones all around the world in a BNC-led campaign that declared themselves apartheid-free. And that declaration is aspirational in nature. It doesn't commit you to anything. It doesn't commit you to BDS. It doesn't commit you to anything, but it does make you part of a global network of communities and organizations that call it apartheid, settler colonialism, and occupation, and commit to joining others in efforts to cut our ties to it. So symbolically, that's very powerful. And once you sign this pledge, you will look for more things to do. Anyone who does, they will look for campaigns to join and things to do with others. So I really recommend it, even starting with your own caucus. The caucus itself can join this. You don't have to have it. Yeah, the caucus can sign on.
Yes,
or any group can sign on. It can be a very small group. It can be a very local group. So this is a good tool in order to start building from below.
Yeah, I think we got the vote within like an hour of our caucus.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
But that's a good idea to send it to statewide and have them commit to an apartheid-free campaign. So I do have one more example that I would love to get your feedback on. So my local campus union, CFA-SJSU, when I approached them to endorse the draft resolution that we're going to introduce at the statewide assembly in April, I think they did an emergency vote that was led by the president, Ray Bucco, and to strike my agenda from the meeting before we even entered the room. And I think it was like 12 voted to strike it from the agenda, 1 abstained, and 1 voted yes. So I think that really reflects some of the Zionist values that my local union at San Jose State University embraces, because, you know, they wouldn't even discuss it. And then recently, this past Monday, the Students for Justice for Palestine, in coalition with other solidarity student groups and community groups, recently disrupted a speaker who is a genocide denier of what's happening in Gaza. And one of the protesters, who is Palestinian, was assaulted by a history professor on my campus. And so I do think that there's a connection, in my opinion, between how my campus union is, disinterested in speaking out about the genocide, disinterested in BDS, disinterested in these social justice issues that I think are really important, vitally important. And the violence, I think, that we're starting to see on campuses around protesting the genocide and demanding BDS. I don't know if you folks want to weigh in on some thoughts or have some advice for, you know, these embattled campuses like mine that don't seem to want to make any movement. And I did criticize my campus openly and publicly, because while they come out with social justice statements just about anything from a cataclysm to a war to whatever, they have been absolutely silent on what's happening in Gaza and has issued no statement whatsoever.
I can kind of maybe start us off. I mean, it makes me think about Dov's point earlier about deciding when public pressure is warranted. And it kind of makes me think that, like, if we're experiencing all of these interconnections of repression, of student and faculty organizing, but also direct violence upon people who are organizing for Palestine, then it's a good moment to start putting those things out, or continue putting them out into the public sphere, making these connections and forcing people to see, you know, why this is a cause for justice and how this is actually really rampant repression that people are experiencing. I mean, I think back, for example, of what's been happening with Columbia University as well, you know, where you had students attacked with chemical weapons, you have professors who were doxing students, all of these things. And part of what those organizers have been doing is consistently calling attention to that, putting that out, you know, in the student paper, in the op-ed, organizing demonstrations. So one thing I think is, like, you know, continuing to emphasize this heightened repression and connecting it to how maybe it's part of a larger business as usual for our university institutions that have these direct ties to genocide, to colonialism, And when that's called out, instead of enforcing actual neutrality, which is pulling that funding, they clamp down with violence, and they routinely downplay that violence. It makes me think of one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, it was sad because the the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion office co-sponsored the speaker that was denying that the genocide was happening in Gaza. So, from my perspective, that, endorses, violence, basically, and helps promote the conflict on our campus, around even having debates about the genocide or BDS. And it sends a chilling message, I think, to our students, faculty, and staff about what happens to them when they do speak out.
I think it's important for us to remember, as Omar said so clearly now, that when we say this is settler colonialism, that this is racism, that this is apartheid, we are in the belly of the beast, yes? This is a US proxy war in Gaza. The US is funding it, the US is arming Israel, the US is making it possible for Israel to continue. These are US interests as well as Israeli Zionist interests. So it's not surprising that the institutions around us are embedded and have a stake in the continuation of this support of Israeli apartheid and genocide. It's not surprising. This is what we're saying everywhere. So we shouldn't be surprised that this happened. Our job is to try and look for the cracks. And a crack is when a university or a union that calls itself progressive or calls itself anti-racist or anti-colonial, we have to show them the contradictions and gain the support that we can through that to open those cracks a little wider. Of course, divestment is all about cutting our support for these systems. Therefore, it's acknowledging those supports. We are not in a neutral space, and we're not even in a progressive space, despite being here on the West Coast. So we know that. Yes, we all know that. What can we do? I think now there are some opportunities for more cracks opening. I think that with the news and what people see on the ground, I think it wakes up some understanding that things have to change. Let's do what we can with that.
Yeah, thank you so much. If you want to contribute any last comments before we wrap up the panel, I think that we could all use some hope and inspiration in these really dark times to inspire us to keep on fighting, that it's worthwhile fighting. So if any of you would like to just share some final comments before we wrap up the panel, I'd really appreciate it, because I need it myself right now too.
Yeah, just quickly to say that the reason why Organizers for Palestine are facing these attacks is because Israel and its supporters are desperate. They are feeling desperate because they cannot win in the court of public opinion. Their reputation in the international community is not good. They can't defend a genocide. And so they rely on repression and attacks. And it's really not working. The movement for Palestine is growing bigger than ever. So I think we just need to keep that in mind and keep organizing.
Thank you so much. Omar, Noam, Dov, do you want to add any additional? Okay. Well, you've inspired us for sure, I think, Omar and I myself. You've given us some ideas about how to push our own faculty union forward. Someone in the comments did mention that Students for Quality Education, which is part of the arm of California Faculty Association, the student arm, have been told not to work around Palestine, and we'll definitely put pressure on that to disrupt that as well. And so really appreciate the analysis and the research that you provided today. truly inspiring. And I think that we can take this to all our individual 23 campuses and do something truly worthwhile, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Those were going to be my closing thoughts. So thank you to everyone for this panel. And I'm personally looking forward to respecting it to the utmost by having the CFA actually do BDS. So hopefully we'll be able to celebrate that.
Onward to victory. All right. Thank you so much for your contribution and your labor and your time. Appreciate you all. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.